I'm David L. Hewlin. I'm the books editor of Alta Journal, and welcome to the August edition of Alta's California Book Club. I want to let you know, if you don't already know about Alta, we are a quarterly journal with an active online presence focusing on the culture, the history, the world of the American West. California Book Club is a monthly production of Alta in which we spend an hour or so talking to some of the most prominent and interesting and compelling writers working currently in California. This evening, we will be having an interview with Dana Johnson, my friend and colleague, about her novel Elsewhere, California. Before we get to that interview, I want to introduce Alta's partners. We couldn't do this without them. Our partners on this project are Book Passage, Books Inc., Book Soup, Bookshop, Diesel, a bookstore, the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West, the Los Angeles Public Library, the San Francisco Public Library, Vroman's Bookstore, Narrative Magazine, and Ziziva. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. We have a sale for California Book Club members for just $50. You'll get a year of Alta Journal. You'll get this fantastic tote bag that I like to promote every chance I get, which is once a month in this space. And you'll also get one of our upcoming California Book Club books. You can find out the details on that and sign up at altaonline.com/tote. And watch tomorrow's thank you email for a link to that, to the deal. You can also visit the California Book Club Clubhouse to keep the conversation going. This is a space for California Book Club members to dig even deeper into Elsewhere, California, to share questions, to discuss tonight's event, and also upcoming California Book Club titles. You'll find links to the sign up for the Clubhouse in the comments section, and you will also in tomorrow's email. And with that all said, let me turn this over to my colleague, John Freeman, who will be doing the interview with Dana. John, welcome to tonight's installment.
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to watch the running tally of where everyone is calling in from Medford, Mass. To Tampa, Florida, Sacramento. I think in the beginning, long ago, map makers were sometimes very dangerous to people who were in the territory that was being mapped. Of course, when parties went out to map a terrain, they often brought with them disease and other terrible things which could not be taken back. And of course, once a territory was mapped, people went there and asked things of that territory, maybe that it wasn't meant to provide. But when it comes to books, I think we love our map makers, in part because sometimes we have to map the cities we actually already live in. We have to know and remember what it feels like to be alive in Sacramento or Florida, Tampa, Florida, or Los Angeles. Sometimes because these cities are so big, and sometimes I think because we just need to remember what it feels like to fall asleep after a big dinner with wine, getting onto a California freeway, say in Los Angeles, and waking up just before you get off at your exit. This is a moment that occurs in one of Dana Johnson's stories in her latest collection, In the Not Quite Dark, a series of stories set in various neighborhoods in Los Angeles, which maps the city and the kind of impressions that you have when you live in a city that is constantly changing. LA is Dana Johnson's Dublin, the way that Joyce cracked open that city and made it his own. She's written 3 books set there. Her first collection, the Flannery O'Connor award-winning Break Any Woman Down, which features 2 stories with the heroine of the book we're going to talk about tonight, Elsewhere, California, Avery Arlington. When we first meet her in Break Any Woman Down, Avery is about to move to West Covina, California from South LA. And she's about to see how big a difference exists in that 20 miles. When we catch up to her in this new novel, which was published in 2012 and was a finalist for the Hurston Wright Award, Avery is now a successful artist. She's living in the Hollywood Hills with her glamorous, boisterous, chain-smoking Italian husband in a beautiful house, making art, but she's not happy. And the past keeps rushing back in part because memories of the past are rushing back in. And so the book takes us back to Avery's childhood, growing up in West Covina, the move there, what it was like and how it changed, what happened when her cousin Keith came to live with them, and how all these things are connected in the present day. It's a beautiful book. It's a book that is about home and away, and it's a book about the intimacy of being known by people from where you're from, how that can never really be replaced, even with a lover. It's a book that maps LA, like I said. And it's a book also in love with the Dodgers, because I suspect that Dana Johnson is too. Anyway, it's a real treat to have her here and to talk to her about this book. Please join me in welcoming the fabulously talented, also professor at USC, Dana Johnson.
Hi, John. That was so beautiful. Thank you.
Oh my God, that is the best backdrop of any person we've had on here. And Walter Mosley had a lot of paint behind him when he came on. What is behind you?
These are, my dad is like a rabid record collector, and these are albums that I stole from him. They're actually dupes. He has copies upon copies of the same album. So that's Dinah, Aretha, and Ella Fitzgerald up there. And then this is a Harry James Marshall little poster I got from his exhibit.
God, that's fabulous. So I was going to ask you something to begin with, but I'm going to jump to another question I had for you, because this is one of the best novels I've ever read about an artist. Not only because we get to know the artist so well, but we get to see her work. And looking at those album covers behind you and the image to your left, it makes me wonder what your background in art is, and if before you became a writer, if you had interest in the visual arts.
You know, I do. I'm not a scholar of the visual arts in any way. And so I'm just sort of a lay person who loves art like anybody else. When I was thinking about the novel, I knew that I wanted to make Avery an artist of some kind, but not a writer, because I hate books that are fiction about writers written by writers. I just feel like I feel like I could have done better than that. So that's what I did. I wanted something about creativity and how this young woman's identity is formed by art, but not writing, because that's what I do. So I took an art class to sort of gear up for writing this novel, and I was terrible at it. One of the assignments was to draw like a coffee mug. And to this day, my best friend sort of mocks me for the image that I showed her, which was like basically, like a 2-year-old drew it. That's about as far as I got with my art exploration there.
Well, you wrote it down well. So this is a book about becoming an artist. It's sort of a Bildungsroman in many ways. And I wonder if you could talk about the importance of sort of writing that story in 2012 as a Black woman. If you had any models that were important to you, writers that came before you that sort of wrote into their own work the becoming of themselves. Lucille Clifton comes to mind. She's always sort of invoking the reader to come and become with her. But I wonder if there's other writers that sort of stood out for you as models in the journey that Avery undergoes here.
Like the short answer to that, I guess I would say Zora Neale Hurston. Just when I became serious about being a writer, she was someone that I read over and over again. This idea of, again, exploring like a Black woman's identity, but there was a kind of like the language, the sort of vernacular that Zora Neale Hurston used and wrote with. That was something that I carried with me a lot. Just the idea of, there is a sort of writerly voice. Everything's voiced, right? But I'm so interested in how people sound, how they speak, diction, syntax, all of those things. And that's something that I saw a lot of, and Zora Neale Hurston was super inspiring to me as a writer. And so she was sort of in the back of my head in terms of, back of my mind in terms of being like true to the voices in this novel. And there are a lot of different voices, right? Because there's like young Avery, old Avery, her parents, friends, all of these voices that she's being introduced to and internalizing and or rejecting, all of that.
Yeah, because a voice isn't just the voice as spoken to Avery, it's the voice that she hears in her head of the person speaking, which is significant, especially when her family early in the book moves to West Covina, and she goes to school the first day, and she listens to a white teacher speaking to her mother, and you hear her hearing the woman's voice who's speaking to her mother in a very clear way. And I guess I want to, before we get into more about voice, this is sort of a very soundscaped novel. And so place is really important to that, and the acoustics of place. And that move, I've referred to it, and you mentioned it, that's a big sort of part of this book. And it's a part of your other work as well. I wonder if you can talk about that move. If not for Avery, you yourself, your family also moved from South LA to West Covina. What was the significance of that?
Yeah, it was about 8 or 9 years old, like Avery, when we moved from 80th and Vermont, as Avery does in the book, to the San Gabriel Valley, West Covina. And it was so astounding to me. Of course, I'd experienced white people in my life. I watched a lot of television, grew up on these shows like, you know, Leave It to Beaver and, you know, Partridge Family or whatever, which a lot of that stuff makes its way into the book. But there was something about living in an all Black neighborhood and then suddenly being transported to this other neighborhood where I was the only Black kid in my class earlier on. It was just very startling to me. I heard myself for the very first time, as people do, you know, when you travel outside of your culture and you go somewhere else, you hear yourself differently, right? And so I had a similar experience when I was a kid. It really blew my mind that I was hearing them differently, but like more important, people were pointing out to me that I sounded different, right? And so because I was a little kid, little kids just want to go along to get along. And so part of my experience was like, how do I figure out how to speak so people will just leave me alone, right? Like, I don't want to be the outsider. I don't want to be othered. I don't want to be picked on. So I sort of learned a way or practiced a way of speaking that sounded more or less like everyone else around me, which is easy to do when you're little, right? You just sort of pick up accents. Every summer when I went to Tennessee when I was a kid, I would come back with this really deep Southern accent that I would have to unlearn and like reacquire my California accent, right? And so it's something that I started out like really practicing as a kid, but of course, the older you get, the more it sort of just becomes who you are, what your voice is, right? Excluding code switching and all of that, right? Like there's a lot of different ways in which we all speak. That was part of my experience, and it stuck with me all these years, just trying to figure out a way how to write about that. It's no small thing, this idea of assimilation and otherness, and I'm not the first person to have written about any of this stuff, but my goal in the novel was to sort of document it in ways that I hadn't seen before, which is why I chose the structure that I did, where you see the assimilation process happening throughout, but you're also constantly bumping up against the younger Avery's voice. So you can see that kind of schism and that duality and that sort of shift in her voice and therefore her identity. So that's what I was trying to do. And I don't think I'd seen it before. And I didn't want to write a linear novel, chapter 1, chapter 2 and 3, et cetera, like that, because I felt like that was getting away from sort of the documentation voice-wise and illustrating what that felt like and what that sounded like.
Mm. In your first story collection, Break Any Woman Down, there's a story about Avery, and it's about her going to school with her brother Owen, who in that story, they're a little, I think they might be a little bit closer in age than they are in the novel. And there's this really heartbreaking quote at the end of the story, which goes, "For the first time, I really heard what the kids in school heard when I spoke. Owen sounded strange to me, from someplace else, using that word, part of a language I knew but was already beginning to forget." And you were talking about the juxtaposition within the structure of this novel, but juxtaposition is one of the constant plot devices of this novel, because it's not just that Avery learns to assimilate by being with people not like her or her family, or new people that she meets. She learns by watching people interact with her family and with her brother and with her cousin. And I wonder if you can talk about, what that does for her as a person.
It's that sort of, you never leave, truly, I don't think you ever sort of leave behind where you came from, no matter what sort of shifts you make in your life. And for me, it sort of feels like this weird liminal space where you're this person that you are, you're also the person that you were, but you're also this person in the middle looking in both directions, right? And so that was the process for Avery, right? Like her brother says in that quote, I'm not studying these white people, Avery, right? And that is something that, like, I wouldn't hear a white person say, to use that word. I'm not studying him, I'm not studying her. And so that was a word that was like, oh wow, that was her realization of, like, she's hearing it how others would hear it. She's understanding that that's what Black people would say and not white people would say. But is that what she would say? Maybe, sometimes, not necessarily in this moment. Who knows, right? It's kind of messy in that part of the book, in that short story rather. That's the first time I wrote about this character Avery and her change in identity. And yeah, just that idea of, like, as a, I guess, fifth grader she is in that story. It's called Melvin in the fifth grade or sixth grade. That epiphany of, wow, this is how language works. And this is how language is identifying. This is how language informs so many things.
And so much of the novel, Avery's slightly off kilter because she's adapting to people around her. But there are a few moments when there's this utterly complete connectedness. And one of them is when the family gets in the car and moves, right. And they're in the car together. And my family moved to California when I was 10. I remember that car trip like it was yesterday. Five people and a dog in a car for 3,000 miles. Of course I remember it, but I wonder if you could read from this section, because it's so beautiful, and it really kind of kicks off this book in a big way.
Okay, I will, thank you. So this is when Avery and her family moves from South Central to West Covina. And I think that's pretty much all you need to know. It's around 1976. All our stuff in the van, and mama hugging folks and daddy shaking hands. We packed and ready to go. We get in daddy's Buick Wildcat and drive away from 932 West 80th Street, apartment 8. I want to be prepared for my long journey, I tell Daddy. Journey, he say. It ain't but 30 minutes up the road. I don't care. I take all kinds of books with me for the trip to the valley. Daddy say it's the San Gabriel Valley, and I never heard of that before, San Gabriel. But it sound pretty to me. I never been to where we going, but I've been to the desert and down south. It ain't as far as all them places, but it's far enough to read for a long time. I've been reading Little House in the Big Woods about traveling far from where you're from. Owen's seen the house before. Daddy took him to see it, and Mama too, but I ain't never seen where we going. Mama just say the house nice. There's gonna be grass in the front yard and the backyard and no guns. I look out the window before I read some more of my book. And after a while, LA start looking different. Don't see no trash in the street, no liquor stores, no Church's Chicken. We driving on a long highway. The signs say 60 with Pomona next to it. I see hills on both sides of the freeway, green and yellow. That's the color of the hills. And there's flowers in patches, yellow, white, and purple. And cows way off in the fields. Not a whole bunch, but cows anyway. Look, I say, cows. They make me happy because I never see no animals before, never, not where I live. Not even hardly cats and dogs, except at the zoo. Got to be down south to see animals. But how can this be so close to LA and be so different? How come I never seen this before if it's so close? But it's not just the cows. They got a big old shopping center out there, 20 Hills Mall, they call it. Mall, I say to myself, mall with a water slide and little cars you can drive with bumpers. A big place for walk-in movies where they play a whole lot of different movies all in one place, not just the drive-in where we used to go when I was little. They got more stuff to do out here, more places to go. It smell different and look different, and everything's gonna be different. We headed west to West Covina and San Gabriel Valley. I say it to myself over and over again. West Covina in San Gabriel Valley, and it sounds like a song.
Oh, I love that passage so much. So when I want to ask you, Dana, one of the questions that came in was from Daryl, and he asked you what inspired you to write this story, and how long did it take you to write it from start to finish? And I wonder if I can add to that question by saying, also, when did you realize that you could make West Covina the heart of a novel, the heart of an artistic project?
That's so okay. The first part of the question is because I'd written 2 stories about Avery in my collection. It was the first story, we see her when she's young in elementary school, and then the last story bookends the collection when she's 40 and living with Massimo. And then there are all these unrelated stories in the middle of the collection. And I wanted to connect the dots. You know, there's like the beginning when she's little, and then when she's older, and then there's no sort of mapping of how she got to be where she is, how she thinks, her shifting identity and all of that. And so not long after the short story collection came out, I started thinking about the novel form and thinking that the story that I wanted to tell was better suited for a novel and not short stories. So that's kind of how it started. And because it was my first novel and I didn't know what I was doing, and it was so hard, and it was really, I was being ambitious, right? It had this kooky hypnotherapist part, and then it all took place in one day on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it was this whole trajectory of like from 9 years old to the current moment with a shifting, assimilating voice throughout, right? So it was so crazy. And I just had a hard time. I had a hard time doing it. And My editor, Dan Smetanka at Counterpoint, was super helpful at sort of like helping me get rid of some things that weren't sort of helpful in terms of the shape of the novel. And so I just went from there, and it was a long, long process. It took about 10 years from beginning to end, because I just kept stopping. I just kept thinking, I don't think I can do this. And so it's a lesson for me and other writers, just like when you think you can't, obviously you can. You just have to keep trying to figure out how, right? Because I almost didn't write this, which is so weird to me. It was that I was in my own head about it in that way, that it just seemed too hard. Because I wanted to write it the way that I wanted to write it, and not just chapter 1 through 30 or whatever.
Mm. And
The West Covina
presumably,
question.
well,
Oh,
presumably while you were doing this, the city itself was changing around you. And so there must have slightly shifted a little bit what you could write about it or through it.
yeah. But I worked a lot from memory, right? Because so much of this is set in the past, right? So that part wasn't hard for me at all. The city changing. It was more difficult in the Not Quite Dark, because I was really focused on downtown and gentrification and putting people in settings that were gone the next year and named something else the following year, and then a parking lot 3 years later. So a lot of the ways in which that collection was written, a lot of these places are just not even there anymore. So that was more difficult for in the Not Quite Dark. Yeah.
Both in the first story in the Not Quite Dark involves a home break-in, and at some point there's a home break-in in elsewhere California. And I wonder if you can talk about the importance of homes in your work, apartments, interior spaces, because even though you're mapping kind of laterally and with sound, LA, you're also doing a lot with interiors, and I'm curious what you think about that as you're making them.
I grew up in apartments for most of my life when I was a kid, and then we moved to a house, and that house was a huge move for my family to actually own a house. And so then once I was there as a kid, you're entering other people's spaces, and all the people I was getting to know, like different cultures. And I was just interested in like inside people's homes. And that's really important to me, the idea of like, who's got money, who doesn't have money, what does that look like? And so I'm always going to talk about that in some kind of way in the work. And so that story that you're talking about, it's set in Moreno Valley, which is, out past Riverside. And that's where a lot of sort of like upwardly mobile folks move, to get to buy affordable houses. But I was just thinking that no matter where you live, that kind of disparity, the have and have nots, is going to catch up with you some kind of way. And so that is the opening story, right? There's this, the brother says, and I'm paraphrasing, he says there are too many Black people moving into his neighborhood, and he's a Black man who's saying this, which I thought was really funny. And so I wanted to explore that. And so part of the plot of that story is that there's these break-ins in the neighborhood, and all the neighborhoods are trying to figure out who's done it and why. And then meanwhile, there's a character, a younger brother, who's kind of a lazy moocher, and he's, stealing in his own ways. So I just wanted to talk about the nuances of all of that. So back to your question, interiors, homes, spaces, places, all of that is always important to me in my fiction.
I love the section when when the family has just arrived and you describe their home from the outside for the first time. And I wonder if you could just read very briefly from it.
Oh, let's see.
I think that, and
Well,
in
I was
Elsewhere.
going to read from Avery and Massimo. Is that the right section?
Sorry, yes, yeah, that's,
Okay.
yeah.
So yeah, this is, it's one of those things where, we just read about Avery's young vision of West Covina. And so now we're getting sort of 40-something Avery living in the Hollywood Hills with her partner Massimo. And he's got money, she doesn't. She's got money by proxy. So she's got the lifestyle and all of that. But she's a broke artist. So the house we live in is much too big for just Massimo and me. This house has embarrassed me with my family miles and miles away from the suburbs and 932 West 80th Street, where I lived as a young child. My mother calls it the crazy house, but it's just modern architecture, a knockoff of a Frank Gehry novel house built in the late 80s. Even though it's too big for the two of us, this is not a very large house compared to some of the other houses on the hill. But it is the one that's the most unique, even if it copies another style. Stucco, cinder block, copper, wood, glass, and lead all come together to make a house the shape of cubes, pillars, and trapezoids. This is not what houses are supposed to look like. Houses are supposed to be recognizable as places to live and work, where children are supposed to play, like my beloved barn house that I grew up in. But I delighted in the puzzle when Massimo first brought me here. The playfulness of it, the oddness of it reminded me of Moreau. I was so relieved. I thought that Massimo did not take houses seriously, the having them and getting them and holding on to them. Why else would one live in a house that didn't seem to make sense? But I was wrong. Everybody still cares about having and holding onto everything they have, even if it doesn't make sense. Mom and Owen were the first family to come see me. I like to think of this first time because it was the beginning, when I did not think much about anything and suddenly did. The past came pushing through to remind me of so much that I forgot. Like now, sitting on my bed, I see her. Mom is here, wearing jeans and sneakers. She's at the door, hesitating at the threshold, as though she doesn't know how to enter. And then Massimo is pulling her through, kissing her cheek, turning his head to kiss the other cheek. Mom does not know what to do with that. Okay, Mom says, nodding, looking at the puzzle all around her. This is a house, she says. No lawn or nothing, front or back, she says, as if convincing herself. And Owen says, shit, Massimo, man, this is nice. But Mom is suspicious. Any Black folks live around here, she asks. Massimo slips his arm through Mom's, waiting for me to answer because it is not a question he cares about either way. What do you think, Mama, Owen says. What do you think? Mom turns up the corner of her mouth and levels her eyes at me like she's about to tell me something that's funny, but something that I've got to know nevertheless. One or two of us, she says, one or two of us might be around here. Got three of us now in this house, don't we? And there that day, the question sat next to me quietly, waiting for me to consider it. Not, what do you think the answer is, Avery? But remember why the answer is so. Still, when Massimo's friends and acquaintances visit, I am grateful to have this house as an accessory to hide behind. I can fade into the house, serving cocktails and fancy glasses and dishing out Massimo's complicated meals on gorgeous bright dishes that call to mind Kenneth Nolan's colored fields, vibrant concentric circles, inviting and mesmerizing. Now I lay out two dresses on our large antique bed, my favorite thing about the whole house, boxy and plain, with distressed wood that looks as though it was retrieved from a shack. I can sleep for hours and days in this bed. I have.
Oh God. As you can tell from Dana's readings, this book is written in these beautiful bursts of prose. And I love that phrase, the past comes pushing through. And it was something also very well described in a piece that ran on Alta Online by Rashida Saka, who has been one of the most brilliant things about this book club, is having her sort of guide our website for the last number of months, and to write her own pieces. And now she's leaving us. So it's been really nice to have her, and she's going to join us at this moment. She's the outgoing assistant editor of the California Book Club, and she's a graduate of Princeton, and has been published in Tri-Quarterly and many other journals, including LitHub. And she has some questions now to ask of Dana. So Rashida, why don't you come join us and take over for a bit?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Hi,
Oh,
Dana.
excited to talk to you. You've been amazing.
Thank you. So I guess I wanted to start off talking about sports, which in fact I know very little of. But one of the things that I was really taken about your novel was how forceful, how much baseball there was. I mean, not only is it just like something that Avery loves to do, loves to follow and watch, and something that she also does with her father, but I was also just taken by the fact that the novel sort of opens with 3 epigraphs, 2 of which includes like Ralph Ellison. It's an epigraph from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and the other is from Jackie Robinson. And I was curious too, because even when looking at reviews of your books, not many people engage with like the baseball. And I feel like it's such an important element of the text, not only because it's like a kind of quirk of Avery and it has personality, but of course there's also like a lot of like potential with like metaphor. And even you write, it's not just a game, ask anyone who cares, look at what happens when you don't pay attention to the game. So I guess like, I just had a question about like the kind of like literariness of baseball, but also even if there's like some historical or even like political context, like late 2000s, early 2010s that you could like offer us to sort of like ground us in the novel.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me about baseball, because you're so right. No one ever talks about that aspect of the novel. And it makes me so mad, because I feel like if I were a male writer, it'd be so like, they'd be talking all about like baseball as a metaphor and all of that. But no one ever has. And so couple things I was trying to do with the baseball. Of course, lifelong Dodger fan, raised on the Dodgers. And you can't see my office, but there's a Fernando bobblehead over there and a Ronce bobblehead. So I'm just a fan, and I grew up with it. And I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about, you know, it's sort of like obvious in a way, but just baseball as a game for sort of America, and who gets ahead, who doesn't, how does one get ahead, who cheats at the game, Houston Astros, who doesn't, right? So that's just all I was trying to do. And I just felt like I couldn't write a novel about LA and not write about Dodger Stadium. I didn't go deep into the history, like the Chavez Ravine history, and like how that stadium came to be built by displacing folks. And if I would write this novel again, I would be sure to make space for that conversation, because that's a huge part of the conversation. But yeah, that's what I was trying to do with the baseball metaphor.
Yeah, and yeah, one thing too with baseball, I was just thinking about like, you know, like if there, I mean, this is quite basic, but just thinking about like horizons and like different like kinds of perspectives or gazes, or thinking like of like an elsewhere. And I guess like I was also thinking like a lot of the book too is about like who is doing the looking, who's being gazed upon, what are the implications of that? Of course, because it's written through Avery's perspective, she is doing most of the looking and we are seeing the world through her perspective. But I guess like when I was really taken by certain moments when we come to see that there's a way in which like she is doing most of the looking, but there's not a sense of like recognition. Like I'm thinking towards the end of the novel when she's with Massimo and they're having like a very intimate moment. And she's sort of preoccupied with like, I hope I'm the kind of woman he wants. I hope like, what if I want to fulfill this kind of role. But then there's a moment when he's like, please look at me. And I guess I'm thinking, I'm just wondering, what kind of confrontation or like what, I think Freeman touched on it before, but I'm just thinking like what the detriment of not being looked upon or being recognized and how that sort of fueled some of her like dissatisfaction with herself and like where she is in life. And I'm just thinking like, could you speak to what it is you were doing with like being looked at, doing the looking, being looked upon, how she's unable to like sort of like meet people on the same terms, if that makes sense. Because, and also this speaks to the title, and I would love to hear more about the title, just because like because she's not sort of meeting people on the own terms, she's like always thinking about an otherwise or an elsewhere. I'm just wondering, like, could you perhaps connect that to the title? Because in one way, like elsewhere, California, I mean, if it's kind of romantic in a sense, like it's almost as if it's kind of this noble pursuit. But I feel like one thing that's so great about the novel is that you never pin it down, and there's a lot of like ambivalence, and it can lead to like isolation and alienation. So I guess I just wonder, like, can you talk about like gazes, but also how that perhaps connects to the title? I hope that made sense.
It does, and it's like a really hard question. So I'm going to try to answer it as thoroughly and clearly as I can, but you did pick up on something that I'm interested in this novel is just, of course, Blackness in general, but as a Black girl and a Black woman, and Avery, and I would argue Black women, of course, in our culture, I feel like we're looked at, but not necessarily seen for who we are and all the complications, right? Thus, you could read a whole novel about baseball and never mention it because you got to focus on the Black stuff, right?
Right.
So I'm really interested in like, you know, what Avery sees, but also what people don't see when they see her. And the erroneous things they think they see when they see her, all the projections and all of that. And so in some ways, when I'm thinking of the title Elsewhere in California, but elsewhere in general, this idea of like where we are in this space is not where we could end up, where we would be. Like there are these possibilities for understanding and scope and amplitude and depth in sort of race and identity that even in a place like California, which is of course my hometown, and you know, that kind of dream, like that state, that fantasy of possibility, that even in California, there's a lot to be sort of examined and sort of like unpacked and interrogated in terms of identity and Blackness and all of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of how I was thinking about the novel.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I guess like one thing, might be a small question, but I was also curious. I mean, when reading the book, I feel like, okay, some context and then I'll go to the book. I feel like when most people write about, like in literature, moments of like racial subjection, there's always like a sense of like bewilderment or even like a kind of like passive like resignation. But one thing I was really curious about with your book is that there are moments when like Avery's like, I mean, even if she doesn't act outright. She's so angry and she wants to hit people, and and of course, on the one hand, that could be a product of like being within like an abusive like environment and her parents' own like tumultuous relationship. But I was also just curious because these moments of anger are also followed by moments when she sort of becomes attuned to an artistic impulse almost. Like after when she has the kind of like verbal spat with her roommate about the TV, she sits down and starts drawing. Or even like after the like apartheid protest, like the divestment at the university, she goes to her job and she sees a bunch of like beautiful paintings and drawings and like sort of, and that becomes like a moment of access. So I guess I was just like really curious to hear how you were thinking about like these moments of anger, but also like how in relation to like art making and her.
Yeah, see, this is why I wanted to talk to you. It was so brilliant, because that's what I was thinking about in two ways. You know, children have very little power. Children, you just, you know, my generation anyway, you do what you were told. Someone tells you go sit down somewhere, you go sit down somewhere. Like this was, Avery's world was very controlled, right? And so I was trying to talk about like how when you have that anger and no place to put it, what do you do with it? How is it processed? And for Avery, it's processed in art. And that's the beginning of her artistic expression. That anger as a little kid, but also as an adult, that idea of sort of like, you know, having to choose between like respectability and not being the crazy, loud, angry person that people expect you to be because you're a Black woman, right? And just sort of being chill, like just chill, even though there's this like seething anger at sort of mistreatment and misperceptions and just racism, basically, right? But how do you channel that? You can't go and sock someone in the face, right? But you can write a chapter for your novel or paint or do whatever it is one needs to do, write a song, all of these things that, you know, help express these feelings. So yeah, that was there, that sort of sublimated anger and not being able to express it and putting it somewhere else. Definitely.
Yeah, and another question. I think next year your novel will turn 10. And I guess I just wonder, because your novel too was published, I believe this summer after Trayvon Martin was killed. And also I think the year before, I think arguably like the official birth of like the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, like many things have changed with our public discourse about like race, structural inequality, Blackness, identity. And I guess I just wonder, like looking back now and also before Trump presidency, I guess, how do you relate to your work now? Many things in California have changed. Like, what does that mean for your work then and now? And also like, I guess like, how does that inform even like your future work?
Yeah, it will inform the novel that I'm working on now. But what's weird about, I had written the scene with the nephew at the end of the novel before the Trayvon Martin incident. And I remember thinking, and then it happened right after, but I remember thinking this is maybe be too, you know, like no kind of like rent a cop security guard guy would do that. And so maybe there needs to be sort of like a bigger moment. And then the Trayvon Martin thing happened where it was just like, it was like the same thing, except outdoors, not indoors in the gallery. And so, you know, again, 10 years ago, none of this was new. This is historical. This is America, right? So none of it was new. And yet I remember thinking maybe it doesn't need to be, I don't know, because it's too obvious, too pat. And then that thing happened. So that horrible thing happened. So, and I will continue to be interested in, again, the police state, racial disparity, racism in general, Blackness. And it's going to come out in my fiction some kind of way. So the novel that I'm working on now is sort of like a pre-Trump novel. And my intent is sort of kind of examine how we got here. And it has, you know, far reaches into our distant history, right? Because again, I'm not the first person to write about these things, but I'm interested in how to write these things, how to talk about them in ways that are slant or illuminating in some way that, you know, that's a tall order. It's like, you know, everybody would like to do that. I don't know if I'm going to be able to, but that's what the art, that's what the attempt is in the art, is to try and figure out a way to have these continued discussions in ways that open the discussion or like illuminate the discussion in some way.
Right. Sounds amazing. So we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to ask a final question. As John mentioned, tomorrow's my last day at Alta, sadly, but I'm starting my MFA this fall. So I guess my final question would be, do you have any advice for young writers or people who are thinking about writing or starting to write, embarking on the first book, what have you?
Yeah, I would say stick to your truth and your vision, because what can happen in MFA programs, and it almost happened to me, is that, you know, I got feedback with people not understanding how to read my work, right? And the tendency is to like, okay, so I guess I need to do it this way because they don't get it, so I'm gonna have to spoon feed somebody some stuff because they're none of that. Like, I'm so glad I went when I was older. I was coming up on 30 when I got my MFA. And so I already, like, I was tempted to sort of change in some ways my writing, but I didn't, right? So that would be my main advice. It's just like, don't let these people who don't know how to read what you're doing, you know, get in your head and ruin your incredible voice, yours or anyone else's.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so pleased I got to talk to you, and good luck. I can't wait to, your work is out in the world as well.
Thanks so much, Rashida. You can find some of her work, obviously at Alta, but at Literary Hub and Tri-Quarterly. And I'm sure there will be more to come. We're sort of winding down, but there've been a few questions, Dana, that have come in as we've been speaking. Some of them having to do with craft. I think the structure of this novel is so intricate. There's a question from Erica who wanted to know, just when did the structure become clear to you? Was it was it trial and error as you worked on the book, or did you know pretty early on that it was going to go you know, forward and back in that way?
I knew early on that that's exactly what I wanted to do. I just didn't know how to do it. So that was the goal. But, you know, it only works when a previous sort of younger Avery moment is in conversation with an older Avery moment. At least I try to do that as much as possible. So that was the hard part. It's like, well, why am I writing about 7-Eleven? So what? She goes to 7-Eleven with Brenna, her best friend. What does that have to do with, you know, current Avery sitting by her swimming pool up in the Hollywood Hills? So, you know, trying to do that and also have a plot and also have, again, the assimilation going on, that was really hard, but that's what I wanted to do. So I set out to do it. And again, a lot of trial, a lot of error. So.
You have a lot of echoes across, but not just this book, which is how it's linked together. Sometimes scenes mirror each other. Sometimes it's a detail within a scene, but also across your books. In Break Any Woman Down, there's a story about Bobby and Donna. And then they appear again in your second collection, in which a little bit of time has passed. And I love the way you do that. And I wonder, if that's the way your imagination works as a storyteller. If once David Mitchell once described this as like sort of a casting issue, like when he goes to write a new story, he doesn't necessarily think, I'll create someone new. He's like, I've got all these wonderful characters I can choose from. Or are there particular people who keep coming back to you for some reason?
Yes, they do, but I never know if I can like kind of work with them again or do anything with them again. In that story, I felt like that character, LaDonna, she didn't sort of have the agency that I would have liked for her to have had in that first story. And I just like the idea of, again, time passing and this same character having sort of epiphanies or realizations that she didn't have in that first story, but maybe she's been with Bobby for 5 years now and the rose-colored glasses have been taken off, right? And so I was just really interested in that kind of shift in a character and what that would look like. And so again, with Avery, that's why, I wrote that first story when she was young. And then that other story much, much later, I had time to really think about, like, what does it mean to have grown up in that way, in those circumstances and those concerns and considerations and traumas. So I had a long time for that to sort of percolate. And so sometimes that happens. I don't know when or how it will. And so like maybe there's like some of the collection that in The Night Quite Dark, there might be a story in there that I play with in some other way later. I usually, if it's just like bugging me, where I'm just like, I know I could have done better or differently, or I see it differently now and I can do it this way now. And so I'm always on the lookout for that.
One of the things I really love about your work is how much of California life is in it, and the little details. Damien writes the 7-Eleven scene is one of my favorites because that is California in the 80s and 90s.
Wait, I'm sorry, which scene?
The 7-Eleven scene.
Yeah.
And breaking down on the way to the Dodgers game is just an incredible set piece, where Avery's father has to sort of accept help from this guy who looks like he belongs in a white power gang, but he actually is really kind to them and sort of drives them in his truck to the game, and they make it in time. Is there some sort of aspect of California, you must have just trunkfuls of things, but is there some sort of quintessence of your life in California that you haven't touched yet, that you think, God, I really want to write a frozen yogurt scene, or I really want to write like, whatever it is, is there some sort of kind of set piece that you're dying to write that just hasn't yet come together?
This is weird, but because I'm not necessarily a nature person, but I hike a lot. And when I hike, there's a lot going on in my, imagination, thinking about, last night I went for a hike and the night before I went for a hike. And I'm really interested in trying to capture that kind of nature of California and Los Angeles. It's always surprising to me when I'm up at Griffith Park and, suddenly there's a rattlesnake or a coyote standing on the road, like daring you to like keep coming toward it. There's all these like, and deer and like tarantulas and all this stuff happening. And then like down on the street is just like traffic noise and madness, right? So I'm kind of interested in figuring out a way to write about the nature of Los Angeles, but I don't, that's not really, I'm not doing that yet, but I'm interested in that. And I'm interested in, I'm glad the 7-Eleven stuff and all of that, that's the quotidian, that's sort of everyday California stuff is what I'm interested in.
One final question on, and then I think I should bring David back on, which was also part of Daryl's question, was what made you happy and excited or proud about this book when you finally got it done and it came out? Was there one particular thing that you haven't thought about recently that when you picked up the book, you thought, all right, I got that down?
I talk about this a lot because it's so interesting to me that even as a like native Californian, when I had written Elsewhere California, I had never been to Palm Springs yet in my life. It was kind of like what people did when I was an undergrad here at USC, like all the rich kids would go off to like Palm Springs or whatever for spring break and or go skiing and all of this stuff. And so I, as an adult, hadn't been. So I was like Googling images and, you know, like just trying to figure out like, what is it about that place and how can I talk about the sort of like significance of that place and the light and how it captures my imagination, had captured my imagination, even though I'd never been there. And I love that because people want to read my book as like strictly autobiography, but it's fiction. And so yes, like Avery, born in South Central, moved to West Covina, but so much of this novel is fiction, not experienced by me personally, but fictionalized and, you know, like as writers do, you write stuff, you make up stuff. So I'm really proud of that Palm Springs spring break section because I never got to go to spring break in Palm Springs when I was in college. And there I did, I wrote it, so.
Well, it's a beautiful book, Dana. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and having Rashida come on and having all of you dial in from parts of California to parts beyond California, which we won't hold against anybody. It's just an extraordinary piece of work, and I can't wait for this next novel. David, do you want to come back on now and tell us what we need to know about what happens next?
Sure. Thanks, John. Thanks, Dana. That was fantastic. And thanks, Rashida. Really just terrific event. So I want to let everyone know that this interview has been recorded and will be available to be watched at californiabookclub.com. Please come back next month on September 23rd. The California Book Club's guest will be Rebecca Solnit discussing her book, A Paradise Built in Hell. And a reminder again, the sale on Alta membership for California Book Club members, go to altaonline.com/tote. Please participate in a 2-minute survey that will pop up as soon as we end the event. Don't forget about the California Book Club Clubhouse. And stay safe, everyone. Wear a mask. See you next month.